Children in the empire had a high mortality rate. Large numbers of children died. And sometimes that was due to the conditions, sometimes that was intentional. Households tended to have a desire for two sons. That was kind of the ideal. With the possibility that if the one died, the other would be able to take on the responsibilities of caring for the household and the family line. Households rarely had more than one daughter. Daughters were considered to be a financial burden because when they were married, you as the family would be expected to provide some property or some wealth to your daughter that she would take into the marriage and would become part of the husband's estate. So if you had more than one daughter, you were going to be, doing that, paying that dowry in more than one case. And so common among the Romans was infanticide. So there was the conditions that led to early death, and again, sometimes children were left to die. Abortion did take place. It was rare. Frequently resulted in the death of the mother simply because of the health care options available at the time, the knowledge available at the time. More frequent, however, was what was called the exposure of children, or they would be left out on the trash heap or left out to the elements. When that happened, they would die, or somebody could come by and take the child, raise it to become a prostitute, raise it to be a slave. Christians, as Christianity started, frequently took those children, those exposed children, and took them and raised them as adopted children in their families. Newborns were not part of the Roman family until they were completely acknowledged by the father. The father had to claim them as his own, meaning that exposure was not considered murder for a lot of the Romans. They did not look at it as murder because it wasn't a legitimate child. It wasn't a legitimate part of the family. Go ahead.
How healthy were the actual families of the Romans? Were they known to be dysfunctional, or were they known to function well?
You find a lot of it. I mean, there's obviously a lot of dysfunction that comes out of some of these things. But then there were other cases where families functioned fairly well, depending on educational levels, and whether somebody was particularly versed in philosophy or something like that. But, any sort of thing could... that's not where I want to go. But you saw a lot of immorality where men could satisfy their urges, and so that would destabilize it as well. So you had examples of both. But I mean, there certainly was encouragement to family stability because family stability led to the stability of the empire. And so that there were laws in place to try and promote that, but didn't always do so.
You said that the children had to be accepted by the father. Like, would it just be like as soon as they were born, you decided then, or how did that work?
Usually there was a ceremony. It's still kind of a newborn infant stage, but it wasn't immediately at birth. It would be, a couple days, maybe even weeks later.
So what would be after the accepting child?
Could be a variety of things. If the father was concerned that this child was actually his, there might be some of that before he would do that. If it was a daughter, and there was already a daughter in the household, that might be something. And so there could be a variety of things that took place as to.
So if they weren't accepted, would they just kill them, or was it like an adoption thing?
More often than not, unless there was, some other type of situation, more often than not, it was you leave the child out for exposure. Adoptions did occur, but usually it wasn't in infancy. Any other questions? let's turn to talking about some things related to Jewish culture, specifically in thinking about some of the impacts of the things that we see in the Bible, the biblical record, as far as societal things. And one thing that becomes very important for changes in Jewish culture is the exile to Babylonia. Now, when you think about it, we could see how this event, right, this kind of political event of the Babylonians coming in, conquering the area, destroying the temple, and then forced immigration of people away from the area would have a profound effect, right? Because you're losing the land God had promised to Abraham. The temple, which was the physical presence of God's, physical exhibition of God's presence, has been destroyed. All the things that you thought God's protection was going to provide are gone. And so there's a lot of questioning that had to have taken place. And I think some of that is what we see in the writings of 1st and 2nd Kings, especially towards the end of 2nd Kings, where the author continually says, this happened because they didn't remain faithful to the God of their ancestors. So your temple's gone. Your sacrifices are gone, right, because there's no temple. And now you're in a more urban environment, and a lot of your laws have been agricultural. And so what you have developing in this exile is these methods of interpretation to try and make the law meaningful in a situation it wasn't originally intended for. So, for example, one of the laws dealt with providing for the poor. When you harvested your field, right, you were to leave the corners of your field for the poor to go through and get grain, wheat, to supply for themselves. Perfect example of this is the book of Ruth. And so it was a way to provide food and sustenance for the poor. Great if you had a field, but now that you're in an urban setting in a city, how do you fulfill that command? What ways do you try to help the poor, right? And so now you have to begin thinking about, right, fulfilling the law, and so all sorts of things begin developing in the exilic period. Synagogues, perhaps, even developed during that time, right? So new forms of gathering for worship. We'll talk more about that on Thursday. So the exile causes a lot of development within Judaism. Then also, of course, coming back. And so as the Cyrus the Persian allows the Jews to return, a new temple is built, but you're still holding on to some of the other traditions that you've developed at the time. Right? So synagogues begin popping up throughout the areas. We've already talked and mentioned, of course, about the impact of Hellenization. How do you respond to this culture around you? It's something the Jews have continually had to address from that time period on. Right? In this case, of course, it's Greek culture. But that's a question that Jews have had to ask and answer throughout. Then, of course, you have all the things with the Hasmoneans that we talked about, and then the Romans. All of these are providing different sorts of pressures. Jews are having to respond in different ways to all of these things. And what it's developing within Jewish culture is this division, as people are responding to this in various ways. And so you have the development of different sects or parties within Judaism. Ones, of course, that you have heard of before. The most popular of the parties within Jewish culture were the Pharisees. It appears that the Pharisees were made up of common people. They weren't necessarily people with positions of power. But the focus of the Pharisees were on issues of purity. All the things that Jesus condemns them for in the New Testament, in the Gospels, are things that are related to this issue of purity. How do you remain pure before God with respect to the law? Now, what had caused problems for the Pharisees, and this is what Jesus condemns them for, is that often they were concerned about this outward purity and not inward purity. They tended to focus on rules instead of sometimes where mercy should be a part of that. But the Torah, the law, became very important for the Pharisees, as well as the traditions of the elders. What did the elders practice and pass on? It was believed that the Torah was not only written, but oral. And so the written Torah and the oral Torah being those traditions. And so a lot of the focus of the Pharisees was on purity and the law. Now, we kind of get a skewed view of the Pharisees in one sense, because in the interactions with them in the Gospels, we see the hypocrisy of it all. But I don't want us to think that necessarily all Pharisees were hypocrites. I don't think Jesus was even saying that. But as a group, the Pharisaical mindset tended toward hypocrisy, right? Making sure you look good whether or not you actually believed in it. But when you look at somebody like Paul, who was a Pharisee, he could say, I lived with a clean conscience. Right? And so Paul, probably like other Pharisees, wasn't just concerned about the outward forms, he was concerned about inward purity as well. Now, certainly, it was misfocused in the sense that he did not recognize what God was doing, but it wasn't hypocrisy like what we see with the other Pharisees Jesus interacted with. Another group within Judaism, or within Jewish society, were the Sadducees. The Sadducees largely tended to come from the upper classes. And while the Pharisees had resisted Hellenization, many of the Sadducees had accepted it. So they had adopted Greek forms of dress, Greek culture as well. Many of them tended to be descendants from the Hasmoneans, and the word Sadducee, it's believed, comes from Zadok, which was one of the priests during the time of David, who is recognized as a prominent priest in the Old Testament. So they tend to be the aristocrats. And now you can kind of start to see, all right, common people, aristocrats, Pharisees and Sadducees probably didn't get along. And they didn't. These were the people in power. These were the people that were in control of the temple. But they also tended to cooperate with Rome. They tended to side with Rome. They tended to get their power from Rome. So that led to conflicts as well. We don't know much about the Sadducees. And the only thing we know about the Sadducees comes from either writings by Pharisees or from the New Testament. And most of that focuses on things they didn't believe in. They didn't believe in the afterlife. They didn't believe in spirits. The only written books that they considered authoritative was the Torah, the books of Moses. Everything else they rejected, including the tradition of the elders. But like I said, not much is known about them either. The Sadducees essentially die off and disappear after the destruction of the Second Temple, right, because they had been so connected with the Temple and with Rome. A third group not mentioned in the New Testament are the Essenes, a much smaller group than either the Sadducees or the Pharisees. They were very, very intense. Right? They took that removal from society very, very seriously, and it left society as well. Lived out in the wilderness. It's believed that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in Qumran, were Essenes, but they were very strict about how someone became a part of the group. You had to undergo a probationary period before you were fully accepted as a member. And you had to obey a very strict discipline. The Essenes also engaged in water purification rituals as a part of becoming part of the community. And so some people have suggested, though there's not any evidence of this, that maybe John the Baptist had come in contact with the Essenes, right? Out in the desert, very strict, encouraging water purification. Maybe, right? But again, there's no evidence for that. It could just be the similarities without necessarily causation. The last, I guess, we could talk about some other groups. There was the Herodians that were a group that supported Herod. We could talk about the Samaritans as well. The last group really to talk about were the Zealots. The Zealots tended not to be a religious party. Many Zealots didn't really have any distinct religious beliefs. They were more interested in politics and getting rid of Rome. And it was often from the Zealots that you had this impulse to revolt at various times as well. Which that might have been part of the reason why you see a zealot among Jesus' disciples. And Simon, the zealot, had originally kind of joined Jesus' group thinking that this was what Jesus was intending to do, but eventually he's kind of drawn in and becomes one of the apostles. Let's talk a little bit about Jewish life in the Roman Empire, or Jews in the Roman Empire. One of the key things to think about with respect to Jewish life at this point and further is that it was a fact of life for most Jews that they did not live in Judea, or in Palestine. They instead lived in the diaspora, or dispersion, is what this Greek word means. And so under Greek rulers, Roman rulers, Jews were spread throughout the empire. It's estimated that at least 2/3 of Jews lived outside of Palestine. There's guesses of anywhere between 3 to 8 million Jews living in the Roman Empire at the time of the first century, but again, those are guesses. One of the key things that makes all of this difficult is the question of who is a Jew. And this continues to be an issue within Judaism. Who qualifies as a Jew? Because there was a lot of intermarriage, and there were people that accepted the religious tenets, and there were people that didn't accept the religious tenets. And so, is being a Jew about religion? Is it being about ethnicity? For a while, it was if you had a Jewish mother. I'm talking more modern times. If you had a Jewish mother, you were Jewish. But if you had a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, you were not Jewish unless you converted. Right? And so even today, there's still this question of who qualifies as a Jew, with some people being more strict than others. Many Greeks and Romans looked at the Jews negatively. They did not consider them very positively. Part of that was that a lot of Greeks and Romans looked down on anybody from the eastern part of the Roman Empire anyway. But they looked at their customs and their religion as being very strange. It didn't make sense to them. And there was also resentment among some people for the privileged status that Jews had religiously. Jews were allowed the free exercise of religion. In most cases, when Rome conquered a region, you were expected to accept the deities of Rome. Now, there could be some syncretism, but the idea was your gods are just going to be kind of folded into our gods. And they're either going to be equivalents like Zeus and Jupiter or something like that. Jews, however, were not expected to do that. They were allowed to worship their God, kept their temple. They were allowed to use their own law with respect to certain aspects of life, punishments, those kind of things. The Jews were also exempt from military status. The Sabbath was protected. And so there were other things like that that gave Jews somewhat of a favored status, at least religiously.
Why is that? Why were they given all those privileges?
I think, well, there's a couple things. First is there were some Jews that kind of became prominent in positions with the government. There were Jews that made important connections with Romans, right? So the relationship between Herod and Caesar Augustus. And then the concern that there was always going to be a Jewish revolt. Yeah, and so, there's several cases, for example, with Pilate, where Pilate decided he was going to put standards of Roman legions that have markings of Roman gods on them in the temple courtyards, and the Jews are getting ready to revolt, and he changes his mind, right? And so that too was a part of all of this as well. But as I mentioned, there were some Jews that made it into places within the Roman government, sometimes even higher positions in Roman society. Herod, we've already mentioned. As far as other people, example of this would be Drusilla, who is the wife of Governor Felix. She's Jewish. So there are some examples of that taking place. Other questions you have? All right, we'll pick up on Thursday, talk about some of the ideas and beliefs, doctrines within Judaism and the Greco-Roman world, and talk about some practices as well that bear on early Christianity.